Last week, we spoke pretty in depth about why the Yuuzhan Vong were able to be as successful as they were against the New Republic and the Imperial Remnant during the Yuuzhan Vong War in the New Jedi Order series. We went over various military, technological, and political elements to the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, and today we're going to be talking about whether the Republic or Empire, and also the CIS a bit, would have fared better against the Yuuzhan Vong or would have stopped them from being able to invade as successfully as they did in the first place. So if you want to hear what we talked about that time, I'll put a link up in one of the suggested videos right there, and also put a link in the description. Now, certain elements wouldn't really have changed if the Yuuzhan Vong had invaded earlier, and we're going to assume for this that any of the preparations that they would have done for the later invasion would also have happened for an earlier invasion of the Republic or Empire. We're primarily going to be talking about Clone Wars era Republic, but even a little bit before we'll talk about as well. The political elements, as far as they pertain to the relationship between the core and the Outer Rim, would probably not have changed a huge amount, where the core would probably have seen it as not really their duty to go and protect the Outer Rim worlds. There are some exceptions to this, like if Munilinst or Mygeeto had been attacked, the Intergalactic Banking Clan actually had a lot of sway within the Republic, and then the CIS obviously, where they would have been able to pull some more support up to that corridor to the galaxy that the Yuuzhan Vong had invaded, which was unable to be done during the actual Yuuzhan Vong invasion because, for one thing, those worlds weren't quite as important anymore, but those were worlds that were under the control of the Empire, and it contributed to an idea at the time that the Yuuzhan Vong invasion was kind of an Imperial ploy to pull support away from the core and allow the Empire to strike back at the New Republic. That being said, there was still a lot of animosity or even just apathy between the core and the Outer Rim worlds, where worlds like Kuat may have had massive defense fleets even before the Clone Wars, but they wouldn't have felt the same need to go and protect worlds on the Outer Rim. There is one element that I think makes it a lot easier for the Republic, the CIS, and the Empire to be able to stand up to the Yuuzhan Vong and prevent them from getting as far as they did, though, and that is just the sheer amount of military hardware available. The amount of sheer destruction and loss of military hardware that was caused by the Clone Wars, as well as the Galactic Civil War, including the infighting between the Imperials, is pretty hard to overstate. By the time the Yuuzhan Vong did invade, which we talked about a little bit last time, a lot of the military assets belonging to the New Republic and even the Empire had been either destroyed or mothballed or just not replaced. The common response to this may be that before the Clone Wars, the Republic didn't actually have a standing army, but it's important to remember that that was an army or a navy for the Republic as a federal entity, the federal government of the Republic, essentially. There was actually still a huge amount of forces that belonged to either individual systems, individual sectors, or to different corporations, and that's why things like the Clone Wars were able to build up in the first place. We already gave the example of the Kuat defense fleets, which included things like the Mandators. Then there was the build up in places like the Seswena sector under Ranulph Tarkin, where they were trying to push for a greater Republic military, and all of this added up to quite a bit of military hardware, some of considerable size and power. There were restrictions that were imposed by the Ruusan Reformations, which is what took away the Republic's overall military, but a lot of power spread out throughout the galaxy would still have been able to be in position to respond to the Yuuzhan Vong, and then of course that becomes even more true if they attack during the Clone Wars, where you have things like Venators around, you have the entire CIS Navy put together, and you have the rest of the clone forces from the Grand Army of the Republic. The Mandator 1 class would be the kind that the Kuat Defense Fleet had, and that would be relatively underarmed, but I would point to the similar example of the Bounty and Krakana, which were two of the Viscount class Star Defenders that were still in construction during the Yuuzhan Vong War. Their presence alone was enough to prevent attacks from the Yuuzhan Vong on Mon Calamari, and the redeployment of super ships played a pretty pivotal role towards the end of the war. So if you consider the completion of the Viscount classes to be kind of similar to the requirements of updating the Mandator 1s to the Mandator 2s, which they were able to do during the Clone Wars, then you get kind of similar results. The Yuuzhan Vong War was only 5 years, but the Clone Wars were only 3 years, and you can kind of see what the difference of mobilization of assets kind of makes, where the Republic may not have had as big of a starting point or a potential starting point with their organized military, but they had such an asset pool or resource pool to pull from that the idea that they could build up over that short period of time isn't super out of the question. The other important thing to remember here is that the Yuuzhan Vong, while they had individually powerful ships, had a relatively small overall force, all things considered. They'd been in transit for a long time, and a lot of their larger ships were old and dying. They were kind of trying to get a beachhead in the galaxy where they would be able to establish new ship wombs, which they were somewhat successful in doing in the actual Yuuzhan Vong War, but had there been a larger response earlier, which may have been seen under the Republic or the CIS or the Empire especially, then they wouldn't have necessarily been able to get that beachhead or replenish any of their forces. When fighting the later era New Republic or Galactic Empire as it was in 25 ABY, they may have been fighting better ships overall, but they were fighting much fewer ships and they were on more of an even footing numerically. The fact that the firepower output of those earlier ships wouldn't have been quite as high is also less important if you remember how the Dovin basals functioned, which were the Vong's version of shields and propulsions. These made the Vong especially good at one-on-one combat with larger ships, but because the Dovin basals could only absorb energy from so many directions at once, being significantly outnumbered, even if they're not necessarily outgunned directly, would have ended up being a worse situation for them. And this is something that the CIS could have accomplished, the pre-CIS megacorporations could have done in many cases, and even some of the sector defense forces of the Republic would have been able to do. The Galactic Empire in particular was taking the end of the Clone Wars and a lot of the devastation that happened in those into account, so maybe the overall output would have been reduced a little bit, but they still had a massive unified army and navy for the first time in a long time, and the Empire has an extra added wrinkle to the core versus outer rim situation. While a lot of the outer rim worlds would have been areas of unrest, they were also areas that the Empire was eager to subjugate. So the idea that there was a massive enemy force entering the galaxy, while there may have been individual worlds that thought, who cares, forget about them, for the Empire overall, it would have probably seen a massive retaliation immediately. The impact of having some kind of organized immediate response to the Yuuzhan Vong invasion rather than letting them get the foothold that they did would have been a huge difference in the course of the war. So taking all this into consideration, I'd say that if you were to have the Yuuzhan Vong War occur during the Clone Wars, when the CIS and Republic had their war machines in full swing, or at any point during the Empire, they probably would have been far less able to make the gains they did. And while I don't think it's quite as big of a difference, I do think that the pre-Clone Wars Republic and all the mega corporations that made up the CIS would have still been able to put up a pretty good fight against the Vong. It really depends there on how quickly they're able to respond and whether the Vong threat would have brought more of them together, even if it would have resulted in a bigger war after a potential Yuuzhan Vong invasion at that point, which is kind of what we saw with the Second Galactic Civil War after the Yuuzhan Vong invasion already. There are a lot of parallels between the Second Galactic Civil War and the Clone Wars, with the demands that Corellians had and the other members that rebelled against the Galactic Alliance, compared to the Confederacy of Independent Systems in the Clone Wars, with a lot of those grievances going back to the Yuuzhan Vong invasion and some political elements coming from way before. Either way, that's going to do it for today's topic, so I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, consider leaving a like or subscribing for more. And if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see me cover on the channel, please leave those in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.